Good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to be here today. Thank you, AlBaraka, for inviting us to this summit. It's a great way to start our weekend, talking about visions, innovation, and ideas. So thank you so much for having us today, AlBaraka. It's the third time you hold this. It's the first time I'm participating in this. I'm Nader Nakib. I'm the Chief of Partnerships, Private Sector Partnerships at UNHCR for the Middle East region. Just a quick intro of who are refugees and the figures we're talking about. There are 122 million refugees and internally displaced people around the world. This was less than half 10 years ago. The problems are growing exponentially beyond an ability of anybody to come alone and solve these problems. So that's why we all have to come together, and we all have to think of innovative ideas of how we can support these most vulnerable people on Earth. And climate is not helping. Climate change is also affecting displacement. 70% of the people displaced are either moving because of climate or moving to areas that are climate affected. 50% of everybody displaced in the world comes from OIC countries. These figures are a little bit shocking, and unfortunately, they are only increasing. The 122 million figure increased by 1.2 million just when Lebanon war started a few weeks ago. Without further ado, I would like to start introducing our panelists. The panel today is going to have 10 minutes for each speaker, and then a follow-up question, and then I'm going to open it for the audience for their questions. So I'm really glad to be among 3 doctors today. I will start with Dr. Mehmet Asutay. Dr. Mehmet is the professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Political Economy and Finance and director of Durham Center for Islamic Economics and Finance at Durham University, UK. His research focuses on various aspects of Islamic moral, political economy, Islamic banking, and Islamic finance, economies of the Middle East, Turkey, and Muslim countries, and political economy and economic development-related subjects. Professor, congratulations on the award you won this year from Islamic Development Bank for 2024. Thank you. Thank you. Just an icebreaker. He won this prize for his contribution on Islamic economics, knowledge and development. Dr. Mehmet, if you kindly present.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I have a presentation, but it is only 10 minutes, so I'm not sure how to manage. But before that, it's good to be here, third time in London, and I'm grateful to His Eminence Dr. Kallawi, but also the AlBaraka team. Thank you. It is amazing. London needs a central focus point on Islamic finance-related development. In the early years, we used to have quite a number of events, but it's clear that AlBaraka event now is the event in London. Now, coming to the topic matter is rather difficult, and 10 minutes. I'll start with an anecdote. I went to a conference on pedagogy, how to teach to the new generation in a very short time period because focus and also the time that we do not have, including in conferences. So one colleague went and he said that, look, example. So you are going to teach students about Romeo and Juliet. The maximum we can do now, Romeo and Juliet met and they fell in love. The families didn't want and they decided to commit suicide. That's it. Then I said, well, that seems okay, but now we are talking about the Muslim word, Layla with Majnun. So how we are going to bring the whole spirituality into it and etc. and explain in a second. So that's my challenge today. Because the issues involved is rather complicated as we are discussing. Okay. Am I using the, do we have the? Somehow it didn't work. Okay, our major challenge now in front of us, and hence why the importance of values in relation to the existing economic system that we have around us. The major challenge of the excess resources. Of course, the existing system, the capitalist system, tells us that, look, there is an arrangement, the market is there, and the prices will allocate that. But of course, that doesn't allow everyone to have to overcome those barriers, the price, the mechanisms that we have in front of us. Those are the barriers that we have. So resource allocation according to profitability, efficiency, and all that. But then there is the other view, the value view, which tells you that it's not necessarily the price, but the values. We want people to have access to those resources, but also the other stakeholders, such as environment, for instance. And therefore, that brings us the whole idea of values and moralities. Of course, with sustainable development now, we have certain moralities. But of course, the problem is not solved by just, as you can see on the pictures on the screen, the reality is too deep. The barriers are there, although I don't consider football as a resource, but that was the most easy photographs that I could use. Of course, the equity solutions, that is what Islamic finance suggests, is a better solution in terms of giving accessibility. But going beyond that, Islamic economics in the middle, justice. The objective of Islamic economics is to ensure justice so that accessibility to resources by overcoming the barriers without distribution or redistribution can be possible. But beyond that, Islam, with its normative world, suggests that there should not be any barrier in front of resource accessibility. And hence, that's the narrative of Islamic economics, or as I call it, Islamic moral political economy. Therefore, when we look at the whole emergence of Islamic economics, it's very much rescuing process. Rescuing human, rescuing land, climate, human, from the domination, even the capital from the domination. So I send my salutation again to the founding fathers in modern time, coming up with the idea of turning that utopia of Islamic economics into certain realities, or at least developing the theoretical form. That rescuing process as a counter-hegemony, creating a counter-hegemony, bringing back the values that has been the essence. Of course, since 1970s, what we have been witnessing, the emergence of different discourses. Amartya Sen in 1970s mentioned that by removing ethics from the economic analysis, we have impoverished the quality of the analysis that we have around us. And therefore, ethics has to be part and parcel of economic and the financial decision-making. And since then, all these different discourses have emerged. And today, we are talking about sustainable development goals. Despite not changing the initial equation, sustainable development goals is an improvement on considering Friedman, 1967, when he said that the only social responsibility corporations have is to maximize profit. Compared to that, and coming to sustainable development goals, indeed, is a positive development. But again, when it comes to the whole narrative, the instrumental morality or ethics versus the substantive morality, the Islamic, for instance. And this is what I'm going to look into, because Islamic substantive morality directly refers to maqasid al-Sharia, the objective of Sharia, and that is determined as the well-being and welfare of all the stakeholders. So when you're making a decision, you have to consider all the stakeholders in the process. And therefore, regardless of all these new discourses coming up, whether we are changing the initial equation, integrating ethics and morality at the decision-making level, or we are just adding as a layer, as we are doing with the Sharia-compliant process, but also with the sustainability. Without changing the whole system, we are just expecting certain practices to be produced. In other words, greenwashing and the maqasid washing, unfortunately, is something. And therefore, the need for critical discourses that we need to develop, look at how we can change the initial equation. And therefore, the distinction between instrumental morality and the substantive morality. As you can see in the picture, the causality is a causality issue. In other words, in the instrumental ethics, which is very much the Enlightenment ethics that we have around us, you utilize religion, values, ethics, just to ensure that you can maximize profit. And today, we are using, again, sustainability discourse to ensure that we can produce the highest return possible. However, the Islamic substantive ethics would suggest that you use everything that you have around us to ensure the Islamic objectives, what is that? The well-being and the welfare of all the stakeholders can be achieved. So therefore, as you can see, entirely opposing ethical or the moral conditions. The causality is different. In the instrumental morality, you instrumentalize religion, values, and etc. to make sure that you are making the profit or efficiency. However, in the Islamic morality, the substantive morality, it is what? Everything else has to be in line with the Islamic objective. And therefore, in the Islamic finance world, what we have, form versus the substance. Yes, it is halal in terms of form, but what consequences it produces? And that's the question mark. The substantive morality, unfortunately, the existing institutional logic doesn't help us. And therefore, perhaps the idea that in the instrumental morality, price determines everything. However, in the substantive morality, everything else comes together, okay, determines price. It is not the price determines. Everything else comes together to determine. What is that? The welfare and well-being of people, so that the accessibility can be achieved. And therefore, what we would expect normally within this value system, each value system, such as Islam, through its value system, the norms, and the cultural repertoire to produce its own institution, its own theories, its own practices. And by defining roles, what is capital? Substantive morality, directly asking those questions. What is capital? What is labor? What is land? So questioning and therefore providing a entirely different sets of solutions to the issue. And that brings us the whole economic system idea. The idea is that the system is entirely a product of the value system. It is not the economy that determines, it is the values of each society that determines the results. Sorry, I'm running. Therefore, the Islamic economics is based on the idea of iqtisad. Iqtisad, when it's translated, yes, it sounds economics, but it's not, because the objective function is entirely different. What iqtisad suggests, ensuring justice in the end. Whatever we do, justice. And that justice relates to well-being of all the stakeholders have to be considered, okay? And therefore, directing towards an objective, a true path, in line with a particular aim, and therefore it is empowering and emancipation. So Iqtisad world, therefore, suggests entirely different understanding. And how that morality is expressed, of course, Tawheed directly suggests the complementarity. That complementarity, that we complement each other, we complement society, we complement environment, and etc. Therefore, in your decision-making, everything has to be taken into account. And that brings into adala and ihsan. And because of that complementarity, by definition, all the relationships have to be considered in the decision-making process. And that brings us a tazkiyah process. In other words, yes, we have to grow, everything has to grow, but that growth has to be in harmony. My growth cannot be at your expense or an environmental expense. And why? Because Rububiyyah tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything to reach to a particular, their own fitra, the perfection, and hence the mizan, the balance order. And why? Because everything else that we have around us, including everyone, is an amana. And therefore, the importance of maqasid al-sharia directly they're telling us. So therefore, when we look at the prohibition of interest is no longer to ensure transaction happens by moving capital from A to B in a sharia-compliant way, but in essence, defining what capital is, and the relationship of that capital with the rest of the stakeholders. Similarly, zakat, because resources within the substantive morality and the value system of Islam, zakat is because all the resources are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for everyone to have access. With the privatization, when you do the exclusion, you have to compensate. So therefore, riba is an expropriation related as well as the zakat, and hence the compensation in both of them. As a result of that, therefore, I'll finish with this one, the whole institutional logic of Islamic banking, what we have. What you have is only the instrumental logic that is operating and dominating Islamic finance today. And therefore, you look at the riba prohibition, gharar, maisir, sin industries, and etc. But what happens when we transfer capital from one place to another with Sharia-compliant way? What outcomes do we are producing? Unfortunately, that is not considered. And that is the missing element. The Islamic substantive morality has to be part of that as the second part. In other words, substance-related screening has to come so that we have to look into the consequences of. It is not only intention, the legal aspect, but also the consequences, what consequences that we have produced, whether we have achieved the emancipation and empowerment that we are looking into. Because at the end of the day, finance is not a zero-sum game or just not the main objective. The main objective is to make finance to be essential part of or the instrument for achieving the Islamic objective. What is that? The justice and ensuring resource accessibility as well as emancipation and empowerment of people within justice. In other words, the art of protecting and financing people, that is the finance should be. And that is the Islamic substantive morality that we have to consider in shaping the future of Islamic finance, but also providing new visions, new institutionalization for future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My apologies.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now I call on Dr. Mohammed Meki. He's the Associate Professor, Department of International Development, University of Oxford. Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah Fellow in Islamic Finance. Dr. Mohammed is an affiliate at Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, the Center of the Study of African Economics and Pembroke College. He's a fellow of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, where he also serves as the investment bursar, responsible for overseeing the management of the endowment fund. Doctor?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Green to go forward, right? Yeah. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to the organizers. So as we've heard this morning, and we often hear, there's a growing call for Islamic finance and economics to address issues of poverty alleviation and sustainable development. And we often hear about the need for more equity financing for SMEs and musharaka-like contracts. Now, the theory is quite reasonable, that you could have business owners who are maybe a little bit risk-averse. They have opportunities to invest in profitable long-term investments, but they're risky investments. And if you only have available to you a very rigid debt contract, then you may not decide to take the investment. You may do a very safe investment that isn't in the long-term interest of economic growth, or you may decide not to engage with the financial system at all. So there's very reasonable theory about why equity should be beneficial for SMEs and private sector development, but there's also reasons why it's very challenging to implement equity contracts. How do you know the profits of these businesses that you need to share profits with? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about testing the impact of equity contracts and how we can encourage equity contracts, and specifically with projects in communities where we try to understand the constraints of the businesses that we're working with and trying to help. The first thing I want to say when addressing the topic of how do we increase the amount of equity financing for small firms is to talk about a very simple solution, which is in some ways very simple and very difficult at the same time. In many countries in the world, there is a very clear reason why firms use debt rather than equity to finance. That is because the tax system incentivizes them to do it. If they borrow with a loan, their interest payments allow them to reduce their taxable income on their tax bill, whereas if they use equity, there is no such reduction. There is a systematic discrimination against equity financing in most corporate tax systems. In this paper that published in the European Economic Review, I analyzed a policy in Belgium where they said, we're going to level the playing field. This discrimination against equity, we're just going to remove it, and we're going to give the same benefit to equity finance as to debt. It's a very obvious result, but I find, as others have argued, that once you remove this incentive to finance with debt, companies choose to finance more with equity. So I say it's simple because it's a very obvious policy recommendation of not discriminating against equity financing. But it's difficult because how do you actually remove this subsidy against debt, which many people have identified, the Economist even called it a senseless subsidy? It's a political economy story, and that's why we need other approaches to understand how do we actually go from predictions to implementation. The second thing that I want to talk about is a different type of methodology, experimental methodology to thinking about causality. In 2019, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to 3 economists based at MIT and Harvard in the US. All of their work, which led to a Nobel Prize in Economics, was based on an institution which they set up, the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which used an experimental approach to address policies to alleviate poverty. They could be policies in terms of financial products, or health products, or educational products. But it was set up as an institution to use a rigorous methodology that has been taken from science and medicine to test out new interventions. And so there's a reason why scientists and medics use experiments to test out the impact of a product. Because, for example, in Oxford, when they were testing out the Oxford vaccine, they couldn't just implement it just based on theory or based on lab work. They had to randomly allocate the vaccine to thousands of people, and they had to have a control group of people who looked similar who weren't offered the vaccine. Because if I just open a hospital and say, I have this vaccine, everybody who wants it, come and take it, and I just compare the people who come to me compared to the people who don't come to me, there's something called selection bias. Maybe the people who come and take a product or a vaccine are more motivated or more sick or all sorts of reasons why they're not comparable groups. So in economics, increasingly we're using experiments to understand what's the impact of a new educational program, or what's the impact of a new health program, or what's the impact of a new financial product. We did one of these projects in Pakistan. We worked with Akhuwat, which has been mentioned today, and we worked within the community to understand these SMEs, what is a constraint to the growth of their business. One of the constraints that was identified is that the amount of financing that is available from microfinance was too small, $500 maximum. So we designed a product with Akhuwat, working with the entrepreneurs, a very simple diminishing musharaka plus ijara asset-based microfinance product, which allowed them to finance a business investment which they specified. And we used an experiment, and we found large positive impacts on their business profits, but also on their household, their investment in education, especially for their daughters. So this is an example of a case where it's a very simple intervention. It's not a very sophisticated Islamic finance product compared to some of the products that you have all thought of and could think of, but it was designed in a way that was rigorous, using the latest methodology and experimental economics, and it was published in the American Economic Review, which is one of the most prestigious journals in economics. And so carefully designed projects using the latest methodologies in impact evaluation can have big impact. And this isn't just for academics. Many large organizations are using something called A/B testing to test out what is the best policy. And it can be with academics or without academics. But this whole idea of using the scientific method in the social sciences is really quite revolutionary, and it's just something that I'm trying to encourage in this talk. In another project in Kenya, we did a similar thing. This is a non-Muslim population. These are all Christians, 99% Christian. But again, we identified that there were these small business owners. They needed to finance an asset to expand their business, and the existing product that was available to them was only a debt product. And so we designed a product which was more musharaka-like, and we linked the payments in that asset financing product to the profits of these small businesses. Now, I mentioned at the beginning it's very difficult to do musharaka unless you have some credible measure of the performance of the business. But with this rapid digitization that has taken place since COVID-19, many small businesses now actually have a huge digital footprint. They sell on point-of-sale systems. They sell in electronic marketplaces. We can see their profits or some measure of their performance, which doesn't rely on self-reports. And so we can design innovative contracts like we did in this project, and we test out using an experiment, and we found that, again, this was a very big positive impact from a musharaka-based product, which helped these small business owners, based on knowledge, working within the community, understanding their constraints and how they could expand their business. And so that was just a few examples of using experimental methodology to explore people's interest in equity financing. We often have theoretical conversations about equity is best. People want equity. Equity, if they took it, would be better for them. But we need more empirical evidence. And my encouragement is to use more of a scientific methodology for impact evaluation. Now, this is just one method in the toolbox of methods that we need to explore important questions that have been discussed today for all sorts of sustainable development goals. But we need methods like this, as well as the other methods which are more theory, more political economy. So it's just one encouragement to think more about interventions. People have excellent ideas for things that they think could improve education policy, health policy, finance policy. Experiments humble you because they require you to write down on paper your idea, go to an organization which is in the field, implement it, test it, and most of the time when we test these things, we find out we were wrong. And then we have to go back to the drawing board and design again and test again. And then sometimes we're wrong again and we go back. But it's a very humbling experience of designing, interacting with people in the field, in communities, and eventually trying to reach a product which is optimal for the communities that we care about. So I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Sefian Kasem, Global Head of ETF and Indexing, Investment Specialist at HSBC. And I heard you got a promotion lately. Indeed. Congratulations.
Onwards and upwards, as they say.
Dr. Sefian leads the investment specialist team with the ETF and indexing business at HSBC Asset Management. He has been working in the industry since 2007. Prior to joining HSBC Asset Management, he worked for HSBC Global Banking and Markets for over 13 years, where he held positions with cross-asset trading, global credit trading, and asset allocation research. If you may. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about a very important topic. Capitalism's collateral damage, economic and social repercussions, and Islamic economic treats. Now, forgive me, I'm not as seasoned as the two gentlemen that presented before me, so I'll be reading a speech more than I'll be presenting today, but hopefully I'll get some key ideas and concepts across in a succinct manner. I'd like to first point out that the views expressed in this speech are my own and do not represent those of my employer. That's my disclaimer. This is a topic I spend a lot of time thinking about from a practical standpoint. It's one thing hypothesizing, but it's another implementing ideas about this in practice. The rubber has to meet the road at some point, even if it means applying ideas and concepts which may serve the vast majority of people in the best way possible, but perhaps aren't ideal for everybody. I'll explain exactly what I mean by this throughout the course of this presentation, as I explore how Islamic investment solutions can help alleviate some of the concerns I identify. Now, it's easy to criticize capitalism, but there are benefits. None other than Mr. Winston Churchill is believed to have said of democracy that indeed it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Well, perhaps many would argue something similar about capitalism. But best or worst, it's what we have to work with in many countries around the world, and I'm pleased to say that, at least I believe, many of the key concepts from Islamic economics and finance can help enhance some of the best features of capitalist societies and safeguard against some of the most significant risks. So let me start with some of the big ideas, and forgive me if I present inherently complex topics in an oversimplified manner. My preference is to always simplify where possible. Some of the key pillars of capitalism: private ownership, profit maximization, and free markets. We heard some of this discussed earlier. These are inherently complex topics, as I say, but in my opinion, they're not at all at odds with many Quranic moral and ethical principles. Perhaps profit maximization isn't a problem, providing profits are earned in a fair manner on the basis of honesty and justice, without exploiting people or the natural environment for that matter, or without fraud, deception, blind charging of interest, and hoarding of capital. These are just some examples of possible wrongdoing. Augment the idea of profit maximizing without the above risks with meaningful charitable giving as a means of giving back to and helping society, and you have a powerful framework for profit-based enterprise and commerce. Similarly, free market functioning is not discouraged within Islamic economics and finance, providing it encourages free trade, fair dealing, and mutual consent. Reference to the permissibility of trade and commerce, freedom of transactions, condemnation of monopoly and hoarding, social responsibility and charity can all be found directly within the Holy Quran. Finally, respecting individual private property rights is a crucial, indisputable, fundamental concept in Islamic economics and finance, and that's for good reason. While capitalism has spurred innovation, industrial growth, and wealth creation, it has also led to collateral damage over the ages, both economically and socially. These repercussions include inequality, environmental degradation, and social alienation. And this is the point at which I bridge to my perspective on how investment capital can be consciously deployed to support certain principles whilst mitigating risks. If we take the idea of individual or collective investment decision-making, there are many reasons why having a fully functioning, rich range of Sharia-compliant investment options can help to mitigate some of the problems I've alluded to. Having a coherent set of Sharia-compliant investment options has the potential, over the long term, to help address many societal issues such as inequality and concentration of wealth, whilst helping to improve economic and social mobility. Creating more investment, savings and pension options for the Muslim community that enable them to confidently invest for the long term is crucial, and that includes new, modern asset classes such as digital currencies. Also, capitalism inherently rewards capital, plant and machinery, that is, over labor. Those who own the means of production, whether factories, land, or technology, accumulate wealth through profits, rents, and capital gains. And as new modes of production come online, leveraging technological developments, labor is potentially more at risk of suffering. In that regard, focusing on governance aspects, how companies reward and look after their personnel, is extremely important to avoid workers finding themselves displaced or trapped in precarious jobs with little upward mobility. The moral code embedded within Islamic economics and finance is not about stifling entrepreneurial thinking or trying to eliminate boom and bust. It's about ensuring that employers of labor understand that every sector of the economy, whether corporate or government, including households, have a collective part to play in ensuring that we all have the opportunity to work to improve our financial circumstances and have a collective responsibility to ensure that we help those that don't. So how can we bring some of these ideas into the mainstream? And this is where I refer to some of my presentation slides. Well, the beauty of Sharia-compliant investment products is that they attempt to do so, screening companies from around the world in a consistent way to ensure they are not major beneficiaries of the sale of goods and services that are harmful to society, such as tobacco, alcohol, gambling, adult entertainment, weapons, and others, is a powerful way to avoid harm. Steering away from companies that are highly debt-dependent is another way of mitigating not just societal, but financial risk. And as stewards of the earth, ensuring we don't fund companies which are doing material damage to the earth's natural capital immediately addresses some of the issues identified above around environmental, social, and governance-related topics. As mentioned, besides our individual obligations and contributions to a social safety net through zakat, sadaqah, and through waqaf-related giving, it's important to be conscious of the fact that when investing in companies domiciled around the world, that some of our investments, despite our best intentions, may in some small part benefit from the sale of haram goods and services. In this instance, it's our duty to try and offset some of the bad through charitable giving, for example, and this is where the idea of purification within investments comes into play. So avoiding investing in prohibited industries or sectors, avoiding debt of the conventional variety, whether your exposure is direct or indirect, takes us closer to a more conscientious mode of investing, but there is more that can be done by stewards of capital to monitor and enforce some key issues that have been identified when thinking about the negatives associated with capitalism. This is where stewardship and engagement becomes a powerful tool. Voting rights associated with certain investment securities opens the door to constructive dialogue with firms about their setup and their behavior. Indeed, asset managers frequently engage with companies on many of the topics associated with Sharia-compliant investing, such as climate change, human rights, public health, diversity and inclusion, shared prosperity, and others. While stewardship and engagement programs are quite comprehensive, tackling some of the most pertinent environmental, social, and governance themes of the day, there is certainly scope to broaden them out to employ many of the principles embedded within Islamic economics and finance, such as reduction of uncertainty, risk sharing, limits or prohibition of interest, social welfare, and fair treatment of workers and charitable giving. Indeed, many of the ideas and concepts within Islamic economics and finance can help to build a framework for comprehensive stewardship and engagement programs, which have a solid moral grounding and incorporate many of the principles most commonly associated with Islamic economics and finance. And this is a new field. As it stands, many asset managers, through their stewardship and engagement programs, already engage with a large number of companies across a number of important topics of the sort mentioned, but there is still room for stewardship and engagement programs to evolve over time, to become more aligned with social conscience, and to help mitigate some of the risks associated with capitalism. So let me round off by bringing everything together. Capitalism may not be the perfect industrial model. It has flaws. But there is a lot that we can do in the investment space to adopt principles from Islamic economics and finance as a guide, such as screening of investment opportunities, as well as designing stewardship and engagement programs that are not just focused on environmental variables or governance issues, which are primarily aimed at shareholder value. We can use engagement as a tool to raise awareness, monitor and encourage change in firms, and within governments for that matter, to encourage them to adopt practices that prioritize environmental, societal, and governance practices in an altruistic way ahead of other financial considerations. This would be a seismic shift in and of itself that would have enormous implications and go some way towards addressing some of the criticisms of capitalism over the long term. I'll stop there.
Thank you, doctors. Pretty interesting stuff and pretty diverse as well. So I have some follow-up questions before I open it to the audience. I will start in the same order as the presentations went. So, Professor, I was so much interested in the Islamic moral economy system. And it's honestly the way to go. And I believe it's still developing. So what kind of advice will you give the audience and people who will listen to this afterwards? What steps should they take? What they should focus on and how we can reach or promote economic sustainability?
Thank you very much. I think over many years since my involvement with academic as well as the professional area of Islamic finance, this debate has always been on the table. form versus the substance. Yes, Islamic finance fulfills the legal conditions, the form, but what it produces in the end, what alternative ways it can bring to the table. Unfortunately, when it comes to the consequences, how we use Islamic norms to ensure Sharia-compliant financing, but the consequences part, when it comes to consequences part, until recently, until sustainable development has become a global agenda, Islamic Bank's position was, look, we are not charity, we have our shareholders, and therefore we have to consider them. But of course, the story is not that simple. As in the morning session, the MP Nasshah mentioned, why do we need to fit into? So we have to fit into the existing institutional logic that has been imposed on Islamic finance industry. That's a particular way of conducting the efficiency frontier. We have to achieve efficiency, the profit maximization, and etc. But you have certain outcomes that you have to produce. So unfortunately, this disconnect or the disembeddedness has been the future of the modern Islamic finance, and therefore bringing substantive morality to table beyond sustainable development. While I have huge respect and I engage with sustainable development, unfortunately, it does not question, it does not disrupt the initial equation, still capital dominated. So we want to achieve climate justice, we want to achieve environment, but somehow in our initial equation, we have only capital. So those of us know mathematical modeling, you cannot do optimization with that. Still, it is the second degree climate issue, human, and etc. You are dealing with the refugees part, for instance. And therefore, we have to look into a new institutional logic in order to respond to the problems that we have on the ground, whether climate, whether human and refugees, poverty, and all that. And that requires a different mindset rather than instrumentalizing morality and repeating the same things, but substantively looking into how we can change things, such as Islamic banking and finance. Why do they have to follow shareholder value maximization? Because this is a different narrative. Why we cannot go at least stakeholder-based governance model through which we can recognize some of the stakeholders. Very simple thing. But also, we have to question the global institutions and their jurisdictions, such as Basel criteria. Basel criteria would say that, look, you have to ensure your risk management in a particular way. And the moment you accept that, unfortunately, what happens? Your profit and loss sharing, SMEs financing becomes a huge challenge, okay? You won't be able to because the risk management. But then we never question where do they get their jurisdictional power to impose such rules on a particular area that is called Islamic finance. But because it comes to the next stage of the problem, of course, the nation states and their constitutions, their legal system, unfortunately, by definition, is based on capital and capital movement. And the laws, especially Islamic finance laws, Islamic banking laws, unfortunately imposes further constraints on Islamic banking and finance, unfortunately not the produce. So these are the general problems, and we have to respond to those. But of course, in the civil society now, the fintechs are emerging, the so-called decentralization gives certain hopes that we can do certain things that we have not been able to, such as you were referring to, SMEs financing. But also the so-called Islamic social finance, which I don't consider because there's only one Islamic social finance, that's the Qard al-Hassan. Zakat and Waqf is not Islamic social finance because that's financialization of the values that we have. These are social welfare institutions. They are not finance. They are financing, of course, but they are not Islamic social finance as such, Qard al-Hassan only. So again, because the capital that we essentialize too much have not delivered within the Islamic finance circle, and therefore we have shifted the entire focus now on Islamic social finance, zakat and waqf and all that, which are very important, but we have to also ask the question why capital within Islamic banking and finance cannot produce those outcomes. And therefore, my suggestion, we have to come up new institutional forms in addition to all these new technologies and new decentralized finances offering, but at the end of the day, we have to consider the essence of the whole idea with financing. That's to achieve justice for all the stakeholders, and we have to consider, therefore, in our optimization process, in our profit maximization, whatever it is, that all the stakeholders have to be included in the equation in order for us to come up with something. In other words, the new visions. I know it sounds very utopian, but let's don't forget that in 1960s, sustainable development was a utopia, but now everyone is talking. So we have to create those imaginaries in order to produce the outcomes. But in the short term, of course, you are dealing with refugees. We have to respond to that. So what capital is doing for those people, refugees, what Islamic finance is doing. Like we came up with, Professor Ali is here as well, a project on how Islamic finance can be utilized for refugees, developing the necessary structures, because majority, as you mentioned as well, majority of the refugees are Muslims. What Islamic finance is doing for refugees, what Islamic finance is doing for climate environment, and therefore we have to come up with new imaginaries rather than just moving capital from A to B, as long as it is halal. The story finishes, the Islamic metaphor, no. What consequences we are producing, and we are responsible with those consequences as the substantive morality suggests. And that goes to regulation, that goes to legal system, and et cetera, but we have to push. We have to push a new agenda on the table, and hopefully it is time to say something new, and that something new is to bring back the morality entirely determining the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We cannot get enough. I wish we have more time. It's so interesting, and we'd like to develop this more, maybe on bilateral level. Just to answer quickly on what is Islamic finance doing with UNHCR, the 80% of the funds that we get in Middle East are Islamic finance, from individuals, corporates, foundations, and stuff. So, but we're just scratching the surface. I'm sure the potential is really huge. So actually, it is there. So we just need to make it formal more, make it the moral aspects always should be there across the board and stuff like this.
But it's not the corporate sector. It's the finance.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just a start.
The capital. Yeah.
Just a start.
Certainly.
Thank you again, Professor Dr. Mohammed. There's something that you do, the Poverty Action Lab. It's beautiful. And also I liked in your presentation the debt versus equity, and it's going to always be a question. And you have a banker next to you. But this is not my question. My question is about impact assessment. And in your presentation, you showed impact. But you also mentioned the lack of impact assessment. And this is also common, even across the board, in everybody who works in my field in humanitarian and maybe beyond. What do you advise? What should we do? What should the audience do for that, to tackle that, having more impact assessment? Because seeing is believing, and more funds will come in when people see the impact, right? Yeah. Please.
So thank you for the question. So I agree that one reason for doing impact assessments is because funders, often multinational funds, want to see rigorous evidence before they will give you more money and scale. So there's one kind of pragmatic thing. From an academic perspective, often because we really want to know the causal impact of a policy, that's why it's important for us. I also want to say that, related to this conversation a little bit, there are some situations where you just shouldn't do an impact assessment. You shouldn't do an experiment, right? So in some of these humanitarian situations, it is so obvious you just help people. And this is not the time or the place for experimentation or for impact assessments. And so that's very clear. In others, there is more of a case, right? And I think the thing that I'm trying to encourage, as I said before, it's one tool in the toolbox of trying to address some of these big questions. There is a need for theory, there is a need for political economy, there is a need for big thinking, and for that to inspire people to, as Professor Asutay was saying, develop new institutions or new models, right? Because Many financial institutions, if you speak to them and you talk to them about, oh, let's try this product because it's better for customers, they'll say, oh, no, the standard product is working fine for us, why should we change? And they're not going to change, many of them. But some of them will, and sometimes you can bring together a collaboration between different types of institutions and different types of stakeholder, and you can design something new. And so we're in an age where innovation is possible, especially with digitization. And so I'm trying to basically tie this innovation with a method for testing those innovations. And just to emphasize again the fact that we need to make mistakes, right? So like, I can take some of these ideas and I can write down a model of a new institution, and we can test it, and we can be wrong, and we should be wrong, and we should go back to the drawing board and humble ourselves, right? And so I've talked a little about in finance, but you could think easily in environment and in health and in education. So we have in education something that's often called the learning crisis, right? We have a target of putting people in schools, and then you get bums on seats, so to speak, and people aren't learning anything in schools. In many developing countries, people are sitting in the school, and they're not learning anything, right? So to design interventions or to design programs that can help people learn in a very kind of piecemeal, micro-founded way, right, is going to be of huge global interest. Similarly, with environmental sustainability, with reducing waste, reducing water consumption, reducing food waste, all of these things, I'm sure many people in this room have excellent ideas for how we can reduce waste, right, for how we can help people to transition to more greener technologies. And so it's just an encouragement to try and actually work with institutions that have the ability to implement those things and to design them in a way that can be rigorously measured. And if you do it and you provide scientific evidence, then you're going to get very big people interested in ramping up these models on a very large scale. I mean, in our research, we've often been supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so if you provide good ideas to people for health, environment, finance, whatever, people need solutions. People are hungry for solutions, and there are ideas here, and it's just about trying to implement them and test them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And now with the introduction of AI becoming more and more integrated in everything anybody is doing and will do in the future, so maybe it will make impacts and more accessible, more easy to see, and they will learn from us, and they will teach us what mistakes we did.
Hopefully.
In the future. Thank you. Dr. Sefian. My question is not about capitalism. My question is the standards that you're creating for Sharia compliance and how you can. Is it accessible? Can everybody use it? Can you explain a little bit about this, how you did it, and what's next for this?
Sure, thank you. Very practical question. By the way, it's been a great panel so far, and I very much agree with everything that my co-panelists have said in terms of defining objectives, having that vision of what we want to achieve, thinking about the practical elements of getting there, including running test cases, etc. I'm a little more towards the practical end of the spectrum because I've been involved over the past 2 to 3 years in designing concrete Sharia-compliant investment products of various kinds. I think one of the challenges which I sought to address was the fact that you don't have coherent, globally available investment products which are low cost, transparent, easy to understand, meet a minimum set of criteria which many Muslims would agree with as constituting Sharia compliance within the context of an investment product. The investment industry has been quite fragmented depending on which jurisdiction you look at, etc., especially within Muslim minority countries. So we wanted to create products which would enable a Muslim investor to be able to invest in a completely Sharia-compliant manner for longer-term investment purposes because they didn't exist. So a lot of what was taking place in practice were hybrid solutions where Muslims would invest in, say, some Sharia-compliant products, but some not conventional products, or they wouldn't bother investing in Sharia-compliant products at all. So we sought to create an investor toolkit, if you like, which met a minimum set of standards. The challenge we faced was really, if you create a set of products which enable investors to create portfolios which are globally orientated, they're going to be investing in a number of different companies which are not set up with Sharia compliance in mind. So you need to have a way of screening them to say, this company, we believe, by this set of standards, is Sharia compliant. This company, we believe, isn't. And to screen your investment universe in that way, create a product which gives access to a market in what we consider to be a Sharia-compliant manner. So that was really the challenge, to create something, a set of products which created that accessibility to markets globally so people could build portfolios, think about retirement, pension, their pension savings, their retirement, saving for the long term, etc. So defining a set of standards was important, and I talked about the stewardship and engagement piece as sitting next to that. So the standards we define are typically around screening. This company is too involved in this specific industry or sector, that specific industry or sector, therefore we believe it isn't a Sharia-compliant company for these reasons. But for the companies which do make it through that screening, it's important to engage them and speak to them and say, listen, you meet a certain set of criteria, which we believe set a standard, which means that you're deemed to be a Sharia-compliant company by virtue of our criteria. This is what you need to do to remain Sharia-compliant. This is what you're doing well. This is what you're not doing so well, and start to have some really involved discussions around some of the topics that I mentioned previously. So it complements this screening. So companies know that we're investing in their stock or their fixed income securities, their bonds, because they meet a certain set of criteria. They understand what it means to be Sharia compliant. They know what it takes to remain Sharia compliant, and they know how they can improve their practices. So it's a powerful analog, if you like, which sits alongside the screening process that we mentioned previously. So that was really what we've worked on over the past few years. First, get a set of products available so Muslim investors that are not investing in a completely Sharia-compliant manner can do so if they want to and believe in the standards that we have applied to these products, and then go from there and start to progress.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. I have tons of more questions, but we have, I see here it's 20 seconds. Can we have 2 more minutes? Okay, I'll open for quick questions from the floor. I'm going to ignore the stopwatch I see here. So, yeah, we have a question over there. Is it okay? Just like giving me two questions? Okay, so this is one, and we only have one.
Is it no?
So you can take the whole 2 minutes. We have another one. Okay, cool.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for giving opportunity to a lady to speak. For the first 2 sessions, I find it a struggle because it seems that Islamic economics is tough for ladies. So hopefully next year we can have more ladies to speak in addition to our MP. My name is Mariza Minhad, Associate Professor in Finance and Economics from the University of Bradford. So hopefully you are fully aware where Bradford is by now. Good. I lead Responsible FinTech Research Group at the university. We choose not to label the name of the research group using the word Islamic, just to be more inclusive. That's what we do at the University of Bradford. We would like to be more inclusive, and we would like to also contribute. Yeah, hopefully we can have our voice heard perhaps next year in this conference. Regarding my question, as a fellow chartered accountant myself, unfortunately we've been struggling for years to measure performance without a clear success, I would say. So therefore, my question is related to Dr. Muhammad's research. I would like to encourage more scientific research in the area of measuring impact of Islamic finance or Islamic economics. So my question is, how did you go about measuring the performance in the context of your research, given that performance should go beyond the bottom line, should go beyond financial metrics? I love using Excel as an expert in finance. I deal with Microsoft Excel a lot, but today, for the Baraka, we should be talking beyond that, right? So beyond financial metrics. So how did you measure performance in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you for the...
Shall we go to the second question?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Whoever asks. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Wahid Raja. I just wanted to ask, you know, the Islamic Financial Standards Boards and the Islamic Development Bank, they've come up with, or they've been told by the Basel III to come up with equivalent regulatory standards for, you know, Islamic financial institutions of, yeah. So I just want to know, at a multilateral level, what have the OIC countries done to have more of a unified banking system, or, you know, common policies, or what do you think would be the challenges they would face to basically come about, to have something like that come about, to have like a unified banking system that deals with Islamic finance and Islamic banking, and basically be at par with the Basel III?
Who are you addressing this question to?
So to the panelists.
Oh, okay. So whoever would like to answer that. Okay, so shall we start with you, Dr.?
Yeah, I want to thank the professor from Bradford for her question, and I look forward to her sitting in this seat instead of me next year. And I'm so excited to go to Bradford now. If you invite me to give a talk like this, it seems like the most exciting city in the world. So please invite me, and I'd love to attend. So it's a very simple answer to your question. How did we measure impact? We did a household survey. We didn't rely on the bank to tell us profits. We went and we surveyed every single participant, and we asked them, okay, you know, there are financial metrics, but there are also other metrics that are relevant to their household. How much is your income relative to your need? Like, how much are you able to meet your household's need for expenditure on food, on education, on clothing, on other aspects? So we asked them all sorts of socio-economic questions directly to the household to understand whether this intervention that we've implemented has really deeply impacted household outcomes beyond just business profits. And that's why I mentioned that we found positive impacts of our intervention, not just on the profits of the SMEs, but on them spending money on their children to go to school, especially their daughters. So this was having generational impacts from an intervention that just helped the business, because it helped the household alleviate its financial constraints. And my colleagues in other settings have found that interventions that have increased the income for the household in some rural countries have meant that they don't need the children to work on the farm anymore, and the children can go to school and invest in longer-term education, because they don't want them doing that micro-enterprise work that they have been doing all of their lives, right? So we just do household surveys to measure exactly those socioeconomic outcomes.
Thank you.
And the difficult question on regulation of financial systems, I will leave to the two gentlemen on my side.
I invite to answer first, actually, if you have a view on that, or I can pick it up in the first instance.
You pick it up.
Okay. I think that the challenge really is uniformity. So I think within the Islamic banking space, you have way more fragmentation than you do with conventional banks. So I think setting standards within the context of all the iterations of the Basel regulation have become successively easier, because I think if you look across at least the big banks, the SIFIs, the systemically important financial institutions, they may have a different balance sheet composition, they have slightly different risk management standards, they may use their capital in slightly different ways to service different target markets and client types. But the reality is that there's a fair amount of uniformity, so you can create universal standards within the conventional banking space. I think the challenge within the Islamic banking space is that the difference in standards that you have across jurisdictions, the way that target markets, so clients in specific jurisdictions, are being served slightly differently, etc. So I think it'll be a challenge to create global, a more difficult challenge to create global universal standards within the Islamic banking space than it will elsewhere. But maybe it will act as a stimulant, if you like, to force the Islamic banking space to look across jurisdictions, see what's happening elsewhere, think about the best practices, and to really share information, knowledge, and think about better ways to serve clients.
I think if I reflect, it's a huge political economic question, of course, because at the end of the day, such unification processes requires a lot of political will. And when you do not have the political will, of course, unfortunately, you won't be able to bring all those very diverse countries on the table to agree something. Even in a more comparable Arab Monetary Union in the GCC, it was considered 2010 GCC countries would be able to establish their monetary union, but unfortunately that did not happen, despite the fact that it was easier because their currencies are pegged to dollars. So it would have been much easier. But again, the political process didn't help. And therefore, what we are saying, in this case, you have the universality of Islam in terms of Islamic banking and finance here, certain norms, universal norms, but then you have the particularities of each nation state. In addition to huge differences between a Muslim country in Africa, Asia, or GCC, and etc. The economic structures are very much different. And therefore, IFSB, IFA, and all those coming up, all these standards and regulations, but they don't have jurisdictions, the formal jurisdiction they do not have. Who has the formal jurisdiction? Of course, each regulator body and a Muslim OIC member country would identify Basel criteria or other international criteria rather than IFE or IFSB. And therefore, it's a political economic question whether we are willing to take the next step towards, and I'm using the words towards, a certain commonalities, at least bringing those commonalities through Islamic banking in the operational level, but that will require further political will. So far, considering that Islamic finance started in 1975, and since then, yes, it is 50 years, but considering the political hurdles, difficulties, I think it is quite an amount of challenge and the successes we have. But of course, my suggestion is that in most circles, Islamic banking and finance is considered as the end of history. No, it's not the end of history. It is just the beginning, perhaps, and therefore, we have to be imaginative. We have to come up with different structures, institutions, as well as the policies to ensure that the unification that you are referring, but also producing impact on the ground to make differences on the lives of ordinary people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehmet, Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Sefian. I hope it was as influential, as informative, as interesting as I found it to everybody here. And I'm sure if you're staying for lunch, people can continue discussing with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry for going overboard.
No problem. Thank you very much.